Hello and welcome to the Brass Band Podcast Archive Edition. I'm Sarah Bauman.
And I'm Kenny Crookston. And together we're here to uncover the amazing and unusual stories that define the brass band world. From its origins and traditions to the modern innovations and fantastic music that have shaped this remarkable culture.
In each episode, we'll dive into Brass Bands England's exciting brass band archive, housed at Heritage Quay at the University of Huddersfield.
So, whether you're a seasoned brass band lover,
just getting started,
or just curious, you're in the right place.
Let's go! Hi Kenny, how you doing?
I'm great, Sarah. How are you?
Still got a cold.
Still got a cold?
Yeah, still.
I know what the problem is.
Do you?
You're not getting enough respiration work. You need to practice that cornet more.
I know, but my cold is my excuse to not practice my cornet, so that doesn't work.
You don't need an excuse not to practice. You need excuses to practice.
There we go. It's all about mindset.
Just join that gang like me that practices every day.
Well, I'll get there eventually, I'm sure.
I'm really looking forward to the first performance when it comes.
There's so much pressure. It will probably be in the BBE scratch band because there are lots of very good players that are significantly better than me across the staff and trustee board.
Well, you can only be the best that you can be, so
That's true.
I'm sure that'll be very good when the time comes.
We'll get there eventually. So on this episode, it's quite well placed because we're in the run-up to the election, so it seemed like a good opportunity to talk about politics and the politics of banding. And there's loads of really interesting stuff from the start of the first bands and their link with industry up to how bands interact with politics today, really. So, Kenny, what did the first brass bands of industry look like? Why were they created?
So this, of course, goes back to the early days of brass band existence and especially contesting. The early 1850s, when people were able to be mobile through the railway network that was very fast growing at the time. Previously, canals were the quickest way of getting around. But suddenly people could travel to a city and back on one day from relatively far away. So you were getting the growth of brass band contests in places like Manchester and Leeds especially, and London as well, Crystal Palace in 1860. And I guess it was the first time that industrialists saw the benefits of having a brass band. I'm sure there would have been the philanthropic types that would have seen the benefits to the players, respiratory systems like we've just been talking about, for people who worked in coal mines and the dark satanic mills of the day.
Yeah.
And all the health problems that came with that. There's no doubt that playing a brass instrument would have been something that was beneficial. And some would have seen the benefits in that. They've seen the benefits of keeping them out of the pub as well. I guess it didn't keep some people at the pub as well, but there was certainly some merit in that. But more than anything else, I'm sure it was, here's a great advertising vehicle for my company.
Yeah.
And I happened to be John Foster, for instance, who owned the Black Dyke Mill in Queensberry near Bradford, who decided that having a brass band would be a great way to promote his company and his company's wares. And many of them like them, loads of different mills, steel works, railway companies, canal works, all sorts of things that would have been around at the time saw the benefit in having bands. And literally thousands and thousands of works and colliery bands grew up very, very quickly around the country.
Yeah. Sponsorship's really interesting because we see bands' names changing throughout this period of time, and some in quite short succession as well. Either the company's taken over or sponsorship changes and stuff like that. And there's a real variety. Foden's being one, gone to Motorworks and various other names like that.
It was a real challenge for the editor of the British Bandsman for some time, knowing when you were reading an article with some historical context to the band, what the band was actually called at the time that thing was happening. You'd quite often get bands sending you in something about a band under its current name and it won such and such a contest, but it won it as a completely different name. True enough, it was that band. I did have the history, but keeping the context around the names was quite a challenge. But yeah, there's a real evolution there. And you spoke about Foden's, Foden's is probably one of the best known that's had quite a few different sponsors over the years. Yeah. But a band that has really managed, probably better than most, that transition from the industrial era into the modern day community band area.
Yeah, and we're still seeing that change, I guess. There are still bands, even this year, who have announced new name changes. So it's still a challenge for a lot of people to keep track.
Yeah, this is the history of brass bands. Going back as far as the 1850s, you had colliery bands that were winning competitions from the very outset. It almost defines the history of brass bands. And actually, I guess when you consider that word that people use around brass bands as a movement, it's probably there that you can see that it started to develop as a movement.
Yeah.
In some ways, a movement that was for social change, I guess. It's probably the one word that annoys me more than anything else.
It's one of your biggest bugbears.
It is. I hate to hear people talking about the brass band movement of today because we're not. It's very much a community music making genre. Any kind of political affiliations nowadays, collectively, they don't exist.
Yeah.
So, I mean, movements to me are trade unionists and suffragettes and, bodies that are for social change, for the better. I don't see that brass bands are that nowadays, but I was brought up in amongst a community that spoke about the brass band movement.
Yeah.
It's not, I can see how it's still kind of hanging over from that time.
Yeah. And some of the really early bands that were set up within industry in the early 1800s, like Black Dyke, have amazingly managed to keep hold of their names, which is quite astonishing, actually, when you think about it.
Like Kingston Mills, Meltham Mills, Bessie's of the Barn.
What were the bands that were really formed around mining? We think of colliery bands. Lots of people think of that being brass banding, although we know it's wider than that. But obviously there's a lot of significant mining history when it comes to banding.
Well, it's the thing that everybody associates us with most, isn't it? Films like Brasov have played a big part in that. Looking back over the years, you had really famous bands like St Hilda's from South Shields. 100 years ago, they were quite simply the best band in the world and recognised by everybody. As such, they became a professional band a few years later. And through the years of the Depression, basically that's what they did. They gave up mining and took up professional banding, which meant the end of the contest for them. In the years that followed, I mean, bands like Grimethorpe were around at that time. They hadn't quite come to the prominence that they did become in the 1950s, 60s, certainly in the 70s, 80s. Enormously successful on the world stage. But at that time, of course, we had the growth of the Mine Workers Brass Band Contest at Blackpool. Which was an event on a national level. It had national qualifying, regional qualifying took place around the country for that. So an absolute enormous cultural event that took place in Blackpool every year. Of course, that disappeared 25 years ago or so and replaced actually by the contest at Butlins that ran for quite a while as well. And again, a hugely successful event. Still managed to keep that tie to mining history.
And a real sense of pride that your organisation could send a band and win, representing the brand of the colliery, but also that you had a really high quality band there as well.
Enormous pride for the village or the town that that band came from. Even recently I was at an event in Durham, I think we spoke about it, at the Beamish Museum. And there you can go and actually see there's the old Hetton Silver Band room, which has been dismantled brick by brick and rebuilt again in the pit village there. But even the culture around the contest that took place there, speaking to members in the audience, very much engaged in the colliery band culture around that part of the world, in Durham and Northumberland, that still probably pervades there more than anywhere else. I think there's still more in the consciousness of the bands themselves that they've got that tradition to uphold. It's a really beautiful thing when you think about it. They really are paying homage to their own history.
And they've got the Durham Miners Gala and all of that, and the cathedral service. They've got a lot that still ties them to that period of time. And I think that shows in the bands and the way that they show up.
Of course, we still have bands that use the name colliery. There's no mining going on, of course. And some famous bands, Grimethorpe and Desford have been the most successful in recent decades. Both absolutely fantastic bands at their best. Times in the 1980s when Desford were practically unbeatable at the Royal Albert Hall. They were a tremendous band, still competing at a really high level. Not quite at the same level of intensity week to week that they had been. But a tremendous set of musicians nevertheless. That's probably something that's going to endure. 50 years from now, there'll still be bands that have got a colliery name after them because they'll just pay in homage.
I don't think we will lose colliery names because there is a real sense of pride of a lot of communities that there is still that colliery band going, and it is their direct live link to their history. They can see it in action, they can see them playing on the streets, and that's really significant.
As we said, we've still got Fodens, we've still got Black Dyke. They don't have that connection with their industry any longer, but they know the value in keeping the history alive.
Absolutely. And we've got a number of really interesting archive items, particularly photos, old photos. One from Hebburn Colliery Band in 1904, and a number of other photos of groups of colliery players alongside stand banners from colliery bands and that kind of thing. There's a lot of interesting items that really marks that time being significant for banding.
And they were some of the leading bands of their time as well.
Yeah.
Hebburn Colliery, a band that managed to win major competitions of its time. It's an incredible legacy that's there from that time. Of course, we have to look beyond that nowadays. We can't just keep looking backwards to when we had a movement. If we want to create a movement, that's a different thing. But we have to actually look forward and see what's going to continue to work for brass bands being engaged in their communities. But one of the ways that we are able to do that is to engage with the past.
Yeah.
Part of our outreach project has been doing that, and I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah. It's been a really interesting project. So we've been working with a delivery partner called Shape North. We've focused our work in Huddersfield around Heritage Quay, where our archive is based, and we really wanted to engage with communities in that area that probably haven't interacted with brass bands that much, even though it is a very bandy area. There are lots of bands around, there's banding heritage there, but there are still parts of Huddersfield that definitely won't have done. So right in the centre, where there's high Asian population in particular, working with a number of primary schools to introduce banding history and banding culture to them, and that'll culminate with them visiting the archive and having the opportunity to uncover what an archive is alongside what brass banding's all about. So they've had their first series of workshops which involved them getting demonstrations of different instruments. They together as a group have decided what their band colours should be and what their band uniform should look like. They've done some creative arts exercises where they've all drawn themselves with a band instrument that they've chosen in their class band uniform and all drawn themselves together. And it's really embedding that feeling that banding is a community that they could be a part of. They're going to create this mural, which is really wonderful. And it's just really great to see the transition even in one day. One of the schools we went in, I think a handful of the kids had said that they had heard a brass band before. And then to go to the end of the day and like 70% of them said that they want to play in a brass band because it's just so exciting. And to see kids that have never really seen bands play in public, drawing themselves, you know, little girl drawing herself with her hijab on and her band hat balancing on the top of it. It's just beautiful. It's an amazing thing. It really shows how much potential there is out there to share the banding story and do it in a really interesting and engaging way. So I think it's a good opportunity to speak to someone now who really, really understands in detail the history of industrial banding. This is David Hurst, who's done a lot of work linked to the Black Dyke Band.
So in Birmingham University recording studio here with David Hurst, who's a long-standing history with the Black Dyke Mills Band, going back to the early 1970s, and a long association with the band ever since in various roles. David, you'd like to tell us about how you got started and how you ended up going to Black Dyke in the first place?
Yeah, it's quite a long story, I suppose, really. I mean, I started playing when I was 10 years old. My father always had an interest in brass bands. He knew all the names, James Shepherd, Leonard Lamb, all these people. He wasn't a player himself, but my great uncle was a soprano player with Haydedge Band up in Home Firth. And my father said, "Do you want to join the brass band?" So I toddled along, and they gave me this very old cornet in a battered old leather case, which smelt like it come from Victorian times. And I gradually started to learn. And at that time, brass bands in the Home Valley used to have certain people within the band, usually people who were retired, who would go around teaching their younger players. And we used to work through the hymn book, learning the notes, etc., etc. And eventually I started to learn myself, as most musicians do. You sort of analyse what you're doing and try and put it right. And eventually I became the soprano player at Home Silver Band, and we had quite a successful run of competitions playing pieces like Rhapsody in Brass and other works of the similar standard. And a few of us, the younger players then, I think I was about 12, 13 at the time, we decided we would go to Elland, where James Shepherd ran a youth band on Saturday mornings at Brooks Bank School. We got to know Jim quite well. He was a really nice chap, of course, sadly passed away a while ago. I was playing soprano with his band at that time as well. Eventually, he contacted me to say that there was a vacancy for principal cornet at the Yorkshire Imperial Band, and this was 1967, 1968. And he says, well, you won't get it, of course, but go along for an audition and they might want you to join the band anyway. So I went along to see Trevor Walmsley. I played a piece for him. And he said, well, do you want to join the band? I said, yeah, that's. And this was in Wakefield, which was about 15, 20 miles from where I lived. He said, would you come on Repiano cornet? So I did that. And I didn't realise at the time what a good band it was, because, you know, they'd been at the British Open and got in the prize list even then, and they won a lot of competitions in Edinburgh, etc. So I was a bit sort of starstruck about that. And I played with him for about 2 years at that point in time. And then Jim contacted me again. He said, Tommy Waterman's left Black Dye.
He was a soprano player.
Yes, he was a soprano player at Black Dye, yeah. And he'd been there a long time. Quite a few of the band had left in 1969 after High Peak, when they got second there to their rivals, Brighouse and Rastrick, of course. And he said, do you want to come and have an audition on cornet, this was. And at that time, you had to play a solo in front of the whole band. So you went into this tiny band room surrounded by all the players there, and these are players like Jim Shepherd, Frank Berry, John Clough, all these famous names that I'd listened to on all these LP recordings. And I went in and I played I think it was the last mover from the Haydn Trumpet Concerto, and I made a complete and utter backside of it, to be honest with you. Anyway, we went to the break, and Jim said, do you want to have a go on soprano for the second half? I said, yeah, I'll have a go on it. So they pulled this old instrument down, which was a high-pitch soprano cornet with a massively long shank, which obviously Tommy used to play. And I said, yeah, I'll do that. And I did the rehearsal. And it was like a duck to water, really, for me, because I played the soprano before that. And we played all sorts of things for the concert. And after the rehearsal, Roy Newsom said, did you just come to the pub for a drink? And I was only 15 at the time, so... And he said, we'd like you to come back and do another couple of rehearsals. So I said, yeah. So I think I went back on the Monday night, and they said, right, we're going to run through Diadem of Gold.
Nice easy start for you.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. So we did that, and that was okay, and some programme stuff as well. And Roy then said, can you come back next time? And then next Monday, so we did that. We ran through Diadem of Gold again and other stuff. And then they said, we would like you to join the band. That was it. It was just on the crux of my 16th birthday.
Remarkable. And of course, you were walking into a well-established, great band there, with some big personalities in the band as well. What was the makeup of the band at that time in relation to the factory? How many of them were involved in working there?
There was a few still in the mill itself. Roy Newsom had an office there, but he worked as a music teacher, head of music at Murfield Grammar School. It must have been tremendously hard work for Roy, because he had to hold a full-time teaching job, plus his preparation time, and then do all the secretarial work, because the bandmaster was also the secretary, and that was established right back in the 1850s when the band started. So the bandmaster at that time would do the secretary duties, so he used to do that. So Roy had an office but didn't work at the mill. A few still worked at the mill there. That had gradually declined over a period of 30 or 40 years, I think. John Clay worked at the mill, Fred Ellis worked at the mill. I think Jack Brooke worked as a painter at the mill. I'm not 100% sure. Jim Shepherd didn't work at the mill. I think there was 2 or 3 who were left, really, working at the mill. And that carried on right until the mid to late 1970s. And I think the last person to work at the mill may have been John Clay, but Michael Antrobus had an office in the mill, and Philip McCann worked at the mill as well in the office. So there were a few remnants still there. The mill was still offering people employment that came to the band. But suffice to say, the great days of everybody working at the mill or pretending to work at the mill had gone.
Yeah, so let's go back to the origins of that, because there was a band in Queensberry before John Foster adopted it.
Yes.
You know, it was 1855, I think.
It was 1855,
became the John Foster
that's right,
and Sons Limited Black Dyke Mills band.
Yeah.
But prior to that, of course, there was the band. Do you want to talk a bit about the early history?
Well, the origins were Peter Wharton, Brass and Reed Band. Peter Wharton was the landlord of the New Dolphin Inn.
That was about 1816, I think, wasn't it?
Something like that, yeah. His father, Peter Wharton's father, was the landlord of the Dolphin, the old Dolphin Inn. So Dolphin was a small region in Queensbury. And Peter Wharton had this Brass and Reed Band, which we think, with no concrete evidence, but we think John Foster played the French horn with them. Anyway, eventually this band petered out with lots of members and things, and then the Queen's Head Brass Band started. Now, we don't know exactly what that meant, brass band. It could have meant a lot of things, as indeed we saw from the list of players from the 1860 Crystal Palace. But the Queen's Head Band went along for quite a number of years, 15 to 20 years, and then gradually began to disappear. It may be that John Foster was playing with them as well, but he decided at that point in time that the mill should take over the band. And in 1855, the band was actually taken completely under control by John Foster and Son.
And at that time, of course, Foster's would be the main employer in the village.
Absolutely, yeah.
The Black Dyke Mill was a huge building that dominated the whole.
It grew and grew and grew from very humble beginnings to a massive complex of mills that employed over 3,000 people. And indeed, John Foster and the company built quite a lot of housing in the local area, in the Queensbury village, to actually house all the workers. Many of the players in the band were housed in a particular area called Scarlet Heights, which was just a stone's throw from the band room at Sandbeds.
So all the players in the band would be employed at the mill. Would it be exclusive or?
Well, I think employed was a very loose term, really. they were noted as being employed, but in actual fact, once the band was established, they used to disappear for weeks on end to do tours here, there and everywhere. And they used to tour in Scotland quite a lot, tour on the south coast. They used to do all sorts of things. They used to go to competitions and stay over into the Mondays and Tuesdays. So in actual fact, the job titles were titles only. They were really, like many players in their day, not just in Black Dyke, but many players in the day, they were actually classed as professional players. I mean, you got to look at the Cyfarthur band in Wales that was attached to the ironworks there. They were all professional players.
You're talking about travelling around all over the UK, and it was a time when it wasn't that easy to travel anywhere quickly.
No.
So it had been long train journeys, I'm guessing, or extremely long coach journeys once we got into the 20th century.
I mean, until the station at Queensbury was built, they used to walk, apparently, from Queensbury down to Halifax or Bradford, which is quite a distance with all the equipment. Then eventually they'd use a wagonette or whatever, and they used to travel down to Halifax and travel by train to the destinations. And obviously train travel wouldn't be that quick at that time. So if you went to the contest in Edinburgh, you would be looking at 2 or 3, even 4 days away. And the stories of them coming back, and these are recorded in newspapers at the time, coming back at 3 and 4 in the morning, and then going again the same day, at midday, to another concert. So
remarkable, isn't it?
Yes.
But obviously the growth of band contesting from the mid-19th century, the first contest at Crystal Palace, I think, was 1860, which Black Dyke won.
They did, yeah, that's right.
A lot of industrialists at the time saw the benefit of having a company brass band.
That's right.
Not just as a recreational tool for the workers, which it gave them all sorts of benefits, but as an advertising tool for their company as well. Do you think this was a big thing? The competition side was a major driver for Foster's?
I'm not sure, really. I mean, it's difficult to say because the band has always worked autonomously from the mill itself. Even when I was there, the mill used to finance the band, but the band can do basically whatever it wanted. So I assume that was the same in those days. And the prime reason why the band used to go to so many contests in the 19th century was for the prize money.
Which at the time was
phenomenally high, in relation, substantial, You'd talk about a local contest, if you sort of work that up to present day standards, that the first prize could be as much as £3,000.
And a lot of the way that bands were graded at the time was on the amount of money that they'd won.
That's right, yeah.
So it was before the days of the championship, first, second, third, fourth sections.
They were all the same.
They were all,
but
it was open to bands that have won 200 guineas or more. And
It must have been a fascinating time for players. If I could only get a time machine to go back and just experience a rehearsal or a contest in those days.
So who were the main figures in the band at that time? Who were the giants of Black Dyke?
I think the two main conductors at that time were obviously Alex Owen and John Gladney, who were part of the triumvirate of three great conductors. Edwin Swift, of course, was the other one, but he never got involved in Black Dyke. He began life at the Linthwaite band, which became very successful and in fact beat Black Dyke on quite a number of occasions. But as the decades went on towards the latter part of the 19th century, Owen and Gladney's bands became dominant at that time. And in fact, even though Black Dyke were very successful under both Alex Owen and John Gladney, their main rivals at that time were Bessers of the Barn Band.
Also conducted by Alex Owen.
That's right, yeah, exactly, yeah. And Alex Owen left Black Dyke, perhaps not under a cloud, but certainly he was working with both bands at the time, which I'm sure, knowing Black Dyke as I do, they wouldn't have been very impressed about that. And it came to a head at a contest where he was playing with both bands, and there was a rule saying that you couldn't play with two bands at the same time. So unfortunately, Alex Owen opted to play with Bessers instead of Black Dyke. So that's where
his card marked.
That's where they're parting the ways.
Right from there.
Yeah, that's right.
This was at the time when, if you look at the prize lists from contests like the Crystal Palace at Bellevue, you can see quite a number of conductors. Halliwell, 5 bands in the top 6.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Can you think about the practicalities getting around to do other rehearsals?
It's got to be train journeys, because if you try and map out all these contests and where the bands came from, as the rail network grew, then obviously the possibility and the logistics of taking a band to a contest were more possible. And certainly these conductors must have done a lot of train travel. I know there was one report of Alex Owen who used to travel horse and sort of cab. He used to travel to his rehearsals using that.
Remarkable times. So, I mean, Black Dyke winning band contests really since they started. Yeah. And still winning band contests today very regularly. Yeah. Now, a lot of good bands have come and gone in between, some enduring and still some great bands that are, been around for a very long time. But no matter which era of band contest you look at, success is there for Black Dyke through. Yeah. What do you think it is about Black Dyke in particular that has maintained that for so long?
I think there's a great history behind the band. There's been some great conductors, some absolutely superb players as well. But I think one important thing that I sort of seemed to learn when I started with the band is there's this sort of almost unique sound, and that's been cultivated over many decades, in fact perhaps over more than a century really. And the secret of that was this continuity of players. They had the same players for many, many years. I mean, people who were in the band when I was, some of them had done 30, 40, even 50 years with the band, and so they established a particularly unique sound, a way of playing things, a way of musically shaping pieces. I remember we used to go on stage, and sometimes if John Clough was playing a solo, he might do something quite different, and it was like a sort of wave the band just followed without any problem at all. And it was just this understanding between the person next to you and then the persons who were across from you, that's what happened. And it was this sort of homogeneity of ideas. Everybody had the same thoughts about how to play something.
Of course, your own career at Black Dyke as a soprano player was a very successful period for the band as well. You must have some tremendous highlights from that time.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things really. I mean, Geoffrey Band was a superb conductor. He was so intellectual. His intellectual abilities, he could tell you about a piece and he could convey that piece in words, and you could understand exactly how you would play it. Not only on the contest stage, but we used to do a great deal of Radio 3 recordings, and also quite a lot of sort of interesting Cheltenham Festival things where we'd introduce new works. I mean, Edward Grext introduced the I for James Horn Concerto, and then there was things like Thomas Wilson that introduced, and we used to play quite a lot of contemporary things, contemporary at that time of course, but that's not contemporary now. So there was lots of highlights really. I think one of the main highlights for me was 72 when we played Sovereign Heritage, and it came to the middle section where you've got this quartet of cadenzas. If you listen to that on the live recording, it's actually flawless. It's so good.
It's very difficult as well. It's really treacherous, tightrope walking stuff.
Yeah, and I remember we were rehearsing it, and Geoffrey was trying to conduct the quartet cadenza. And after about 10, 15 minutes of doing this, I think it was either Jim or John Clough. I said, "Mr. Brand, we don't need to conduct. Please, can you stop conducting?" So they just
let them get on with
they
it.
just did it themselves, you know. And as I say, this is part of what I mean by the understanding between the players was so good. They knew exactly where to move and where not to move and how to do things. And I say, on the live record of the contest, it's absolutely flawless.
That was a great year for the band as well, of course.
Yeah,
You
it
did
was,
the double
yeah.
that year. You won by Kensington Concerto at the Albert Hall. So it's great to be in part of that history, I
But I
guess.
think it's like a lot of bands. Once you learn how to win, I mean, it's like choirs, isn't it? And now you've got Fordens who do the same thing. When you learn how to win, you can go on stage and just do it. And I think that's exactly what happened in the 70s. You know, everything fell into place.
And what that actually induces is a mindset in other bands as well. Because 10 years later than that, I was playing for Whitburn against
Yeah.
Black Dyke regularly.
Yeah.
And to be perfectly honest with you, we were beaten before we walked on stage.
Yeah.
We just knew that they were better.
Yeah.
They could only really beat themselves at that time.
Yeah.
They were the best band around.
That's right, yeah.
And it bred that kind of element of competition that they had around them without even blowing a note.
Yeah.
You know, it's
Yeah.
just the reputation is so great.
Yeah. And I think it got to a stage where they got fed up of winning. It was one of those.
Does that happen? Is that a thing?
I'm not sure. I was, yeah. Oh, winning again.
I guess there's a thing when it becomes a relief when you win rather than a joy, and I think that's the point. really.
Yes, I think that is quite true. Yes, I mean, once you've won quite a few, I think that is quite true. The relief that you've still managed to do it.
And that's maybe the point, you shouldn't be doing it any longer.
Yeah, that's right.
Or maybe you're doing it for different reasons.
Yeah. I mean, it's like anything, the winning streak can come to an end. And we know that it will do, for no other reason than it just comes to an end.
As we said, we've got all these great bands through our history that have had phenomenally successful periods. St Hilda Colliery in the 1920s, Fordens in the 1930s, Fairies and Sarah West Manchester. And none of them have lasted forever. But the band that has endured and still a great band 160 years later
that's right.
is Black Dyke.
Yeah.
Quite a remarkable history. You stayed with Black Dyke for your first spell, about 4 or 5 years?
69 to 74, so it's about 5 years.
Yeah, so a great period. And then you went and played with Jim Shepherd versus
Yes, I
Brass,
did,
which at the time was absolutely a phenomenon.
Yes, it was,
That came about when a number of players led by Jim
that's right.
left Black Dyke and other bands at the time and formed this. That, I think if there was anything in my whole life of brass bands that could be described as groundbreaking, that was it.
It was at the time, I think it was, I mean, Jim had wanted to do something like that for quite a long time, and it came to a head, really, at the end of 72, after the win at London, Kensington Concerto. It started the group, I think, by then. They'd done one or two little things, and there was a little bit of sort of unrest in the band that might take precedence. And Jim's idea was never that it would take precedence at all over the band. And there was players from a lot of different bands, like David Moore at Grimethorpe, Peter Hammonds, Black Dyke, Gordon Higginbottom. I think he played at Cedar West then.
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
Wingates and Cedar West.
Wingates, that's right. So there were quite a few bands that had to avoid diary clashes, and Jim was always adamant that would never happen. But like all bands, politics begin to play a role, and I think Roy decided that he didn't want this to happen, and I think Jim was written to by Roy, and that's when Jim decided that they would form the group and go full-time, really. I joined a couple of years after that to play cornet with the group. I'd got an interest in conducting at that time, and that was beginning to take precedence. And so I left the group to do quite a lot of trumpet playing at the time. I was doing a lot of Baroque trumpet playing and at Leeds Grant Theatre in the pit orchestra. So I was doing a lot of things, really. So I decided to leave the group then.
But you did go back to Black Dyke.
I went back to Black Dyke, when David Carter resigned from the band. I got a call from Philip saying, would you like to come back to the band? And so I did for a couple of years, but the same problems arose that I was doing lots of other things. And after we won on Volcano in 79, I came to the decision that I was going to pursue conducting on a more serious basis.
Of course, you did very successfully, and then a long association, of course, with Brickhouse and Rastrick
Yeah,
Band.
that's right,
A very successful time for them as well.
Yeah.
So you've had quite an active and successful career in brass bands over a very long period, and of course you returned to Black Dyke for a final, well, we think it might be a final time.
You never know.
You never know. For a third time, as the band secretary for a while, just a few years ago.
That was good, I enjoyed that. That was really good. We decided to move to Worcestershire, which made the travel a little bit difficult. But it was good. I mean, the band was doing well at the time, and it was nice to work with Nick, because Nick is very meticulous in what he does. His preparation is very meticulous. His rehearsals are planned to the minute, and he works very, very hard, not just in the band room with the band, but he works very hard behind the scenes. He's always had an interest in Black Dyke, and he remains the focal point of everything that they actually do. So credit to Nick and the band itself.
And off the back of that period, you've written this fantastic book, The Celebrated Black Dyke Mills Band, the Victorian Years, which is available from all good bookshops and publishers. And if anybody's listening is interested in this, either get in touch with BB, or I'm sure you can do an internet search and find it very easily. But it's great that the history of that great band, that unique period as well, has been recorded for everybody to see.
I think the history of every band is important, really. I mean, a lot of bands have all these old photographs on the wall, don't they? Or the band, they don't know who they are. No. And I wanted to concentrate on some of the people that were in the background there, and names rather than just contest results and things like that. And I've done some research into my own local bands, Home Syllab, which is now sadly defunct. And it is very interesting how these bands were formed and what they did. Of course, there's not a lot of detail about these, but I think we should take an interest.
It's a great social history as well. I always find when you do delve into the history of a band, it's not the fact that the fella was a great euphonium player or a great solo chord,
that's right.
but he was also the town barber.
Yeah, that's
or he was a train driver or whatever.
That's right,
and of course that still continues today in bands.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Listen, David, it's been an absolute joy talking to you about the history of this great band.
Yeah, thank you.
It's been great.
Yeah, good.
Thanks so much. And that was the March BB and CF, well known to many of our listeners, I'm sure. For those who are wondering what the abbreviations stand for, it is, of course, the British Bandsman and Contest Field. The march was written by James Ord Hume, who was actually the editor of the Contest Field at the time. Contest Field was a monthly supplement to the British Bandsman, which was exactly what it says on the tin. Yeah. It was about contesting purely. So, a bit of interesting history behind that march, Sarah.
There you go.
And that was played by Grimethorpe Colliery Band, conducted by the great Elgar Howarth. That actually leads us to one of the more interesting pieces in the archive, which is the New Party Sir Oswald Mosley Silver Challenge Cup from 1931. Sarah, would you like to tell us a bit more about this fascinating piece?
Yeah, this was one of the items that really caught my eye, and I just find really fascinating. It's placed at a really interesting time politically. So the New Party was a very short-lived political party, only in existence between 1930 and 1931, just before he set up the British Union of Fascists. So he set up the BUF in 1932. I think it says a lot about who the new party was looking to target. After being affiliated with the Conservatives, he then moved to Labour, and from Labour set up the new party. And I think that was quite a specific move to target working class communities to bring him on board with his messaging. Reasonably right-wing messaging.
Reasonably right-wing.
The British Union of Fascists, fairly right-wing. But just an interesting shift from him to look to banding as a group that he felt he could bring on board.
So it was actually the first prize for a competition held in Derbyshire, Eckington in Derbyshire, won by the Broadsworth Colliery Band.
Yeah. Which
is another band with a great history. That one of the last things I can remember them doing was actually playing in the European Brass Band Championships, believe it or not, in 1983. They qualified as the English band that year.
Yeah.
So a band with a great history as well. But a lot of colliery bands in the lineup, clearly their socialist roots were put to one side for the day while we went to the new party competition.
I think it's fair to say that banding now is a broad political spectrum in terms of who's involved. But at this point in time, that definitely wouldn't have been the case. And these were very much colliery workers taking part in this competitions. It was very much a working class pastime.
And it would have been an entirely male working class pastime at the time as well.
So to dive in a little bit more into the role of brass bands in politics, I'm going to speak to journalist and historian Ewan Fox. So I'm joined today with music journalist Ewan Fox. How are you doing, Ewan?
How are you, Sarah? Lovely to catch up with you.
Great. So when we were thinking about the politics of banding episode, our minds went to you for a number of reasons. I know that you're someone who politics in all forms is important to what you do. Do you think bands are an important force in politics? Do you think they have a political role?
I think they very much have a political role to play. And I think we have to look at politics in the widest scope to start off with to find out where we actually fit in. You know, this politics, what I say with a big P, which is the stuff that actually affects us, the decisions made by supposedly our betters in Parliament, things like finance and education, arts and culture, etc. And they've got a direct effect what we actually do in the banding world. And then there's the politics that I would say with a small p, which is stuff which occurs in communities themselves, historically, the way in which bands have been linked into the local communities, how they've been linked in with business, etc. And then, of course, the third part is the one that gets us going all the time, is the politics of banding itself, the way in which we run, etc., competitions, and our outlook on different things as well, how we connect to other parts, how we link up with business, of course, how we link up with the arts and cultural movements in the UK, so we don't end up being isolated. Yeah, politics plays a role in everything I think that we do within banding.
Absolutely. And something we found really fascinating whilst diving into the archive is a lot of people would associate bands with the miners' strikes. But when it comes down to it, in the journalism of the time, it was barely mentioned. I don't know what you feel about that, whether you as a music journalist would feel that you have that role to comment on those links.
Well, political links with banding and the mining movement have been well established. You know, when we talk about the mining strike, of course, with a bit of a historical hat on, you were talking, I think, specifically about the 1984 miners' strike. But of course, for those who are slightly a bit older than you, we'd remember there was a miners' strike in the early 70s, which caused a great deal of political unrest. There was a miners' strike going back even further than that, back to the 1920s, which resulted in what was called then the general strike. So the mining industry politically has been exceptionally strong within the UK. And because of that, of course, there's that link with brass bands. Through the mining industry, of course, was the setting up what we call CISWO in South Wales, CISWO, I think you call it elsewhere, which was like the social side to look after the welfare of miners. That really was a political decision with regards to that. And that resulted in the National Mine Workers Championships, which took place in, the first one I think was about 1962. That went on up until the 1990s, which encompassed the strikes from the 1970s and the strikes from the 1980s. That finally died away with the demise of the mining industry and then was revived with the Butlins Mine Workers Championships. So I guess that link then was actually brought back. So in respect to the mining industry, it's a long and proud troubled tradition as well at times, but something that bands have very much played a part of. And as you said, what we've done sometimes hasn't really been reported within the banding press and possibly in the national media.
Yeah, and like you say, it was a political decision for bands to be created in the first place. Absolutely. We are intrinsically linked.
Yeah, we're intrinsically linked with, as I say, the wider big P political part of it. Brass bands were created through a combination of Victorian rectitude, which was a political force to try and help the betterment of working people. There was the liberalisation of finance, which created hire purchase schemes, which came through Parliament and then enabled bands and people to buy musical instruments and made it more affordable. And then you got the workers themselves with possibly 1 day a week off or then increased leisure time, what they did with it. And music became a very important part of that. And then the final part of it, then you've got the economic boom that occurred with the railways, etc., which enabled people then to move and play in competitions and made banding a much more mobile contesting phenomenon. And especially at the height of the Victorian times where rail excursion day tickets to things like Bellevue, etc., that's what fueled those events. So we're linked in all sorts of ways going back to decisions that were made at Parliament, which has trickled down in some way and has helped us as a banding movement, and has helped us then create, as you say, with the miners and in the mining industry and also in different industries, where more benevolent owners thought brass bands were actually good for the morale of their workers. Some didn't, I have to say. If you look back at people like the famous Gavartha Works Band, which really was in the 1860s at the peak of its powers, that had one of the most horrible owners you'd ever thought anywhere in the world. The band had everything given to them. They even had uniforms, I think, with 18-karat gold buttons. And if you go to the place in Merthyr where they play, in the museum there, and you see the instruments, the music is incredible. They were playing music which literally months prior to them playing it was actually being performed in Milan. And somebody was just transcribing it and bringing it back to the UK. Yet, their owner, when he died and was buried, is buried beneath an iron slab. And all it says on top is, "God forgive me," because he knew how bad a chap he was. So, yep, there's been good stuff with regards to it in both the industries, but I'm afraid there's been some bad ones as well.
And I think we continue to rely on political decisions for a lot of the money that comes into bands, particularly through Arts Council England. You know, it's a different lens, but that's still the case. And certainly for Brass Bands England's funding and the work that we do to support the sector, a big proportion of that comes from government money and political decisions. Is that a place where you think we should be, that we should be a politically funded movement and a government funded movement?
Yeah, well, we've got to be. We're an essential part of the social fabric of the UK. I know people say, how is it that other areas of the arts get a great deal of money? But going back to your initial point with regards to the mining industry, of course, there was almost like a support network of financing brass bands. It came a lot through the mining industry and the mining bands, etc. A lot in other areas where industry, from carpet makers to cloth makers to shoemakers, all supported brass bands for a period of time. Once that finished, I think we missed the trick to find out how we're going to make sure that we got a regular stream of financing to try and get back into banding. It came here and there at different times in the following years. For instance, talking about big political decisions, when the National Lottery funding came through for bands to have instruments. And at a difficult time, bands were getting hundreds of thousands of pounds of public money to help them survive. That's now 25 years plus ago. So possibly the time is ripe for us to use our political power and also get our parliamentarians to shout our case again for a new generation of, especially young players, to be given the opportunity to play on really high quality instruments. We've got to use that political nous that we have got to try and get representation out from yourselves through Brass Bands England, through Creative Scotland, through the Scottish Brass Band Association, hopefully, fingers crossed, that possibly at one time in Wales with ourselves as well. We've got to be more politically aware of what we have got and how we use our power. Other people do it. If you look at, for instance, the orchestral world, National Youth Orchestra of Great Britain, etc., and those people, they've been doing it for 20 odd years plus. And guess what? They've been very successful at it. So we can do it as long as we've got the willpower, the vision to do it. And most of all, the people understand the reason why we need to do it. It's not a handout, because what money we have, you've got to use. You can't just say thanks very much and we spend it as you know with Brass Bands England, you've got to show outcomes about the money.
Yeah.
And we can do that, but sometimes we're not very good at shouting out both why we need it and at the end of it, the great results that come of it. So I think we have to do that. And that really is a political decision.
Yeah, it's an investment into us, an investment into the arts and the future of brass banding. Okay, so thinking about individual bands, more so from the wider sector, you are very, very involved and have been for a long time with the Chadiga Band, who have a history of really interesting and meaningful programming, in particular your involvement with the film Pride. What was that like, being involved in a project like that had amazing messaging around it?
Well, the first thing, again, we link it back for your initial question. It's all to do with the miners' strike. It's to do with the 1984 miners' strike. It's a well-known story. It's romanticised, I have to say, in the film. It is very much romanticised. It's a very funny film, quite dark in a way. In many ways, it looks at in the same way as Brassed Off. If you take away the tropes and the comedy side of it, whatever, there's a darker, much more serious message about it. The message with the Pride film, of course, is the way in which people from the LGBT community were being treated during that time. And talking about the political decisions with regards to that, there was something called Section 28 horrible piece of legislation which was pushed through at the times and really did alienate people. It was also linked, of course, with the health scares which came across with HIV virus, etc. as well. So it was a very, very dangerous time in all aspects for people within those communities. The story that came out of it is heartwarming, you know, and it's amazing to think that a group of people in London who found out about a group of people in South Wales who were having the same sorts of challenges made by political decisions, or they felt were made by political decisions, came together and didn't change the world, because in a way the miners, at the end of the miners' strike, it wasn't a Pyrrhic victory, it was a defeat. What happened from that is well documented. What happened with regards to the LGBT community, etc., can be seen as the beginning of hopefully what will be a great victory for them and equality. So, yeah, it was an uplifting thing to be. And when we were approached to be part of it, strangely, it was about a week before we went to the British Open in 2013. The composer got in contact with us. We invited him to come along to the British Open to hear the band. He listened to 3 bands. One of them was us, and disappeared because he had to go to meetings. And I phoned him up later and told him that we had won. So he said, "Oh, right, you the band then that we need to have to play the film." If we got relegated, it most probably would have been somebody else, but it was Tredegar. But we spoke to the people involved, and it produced really a long-term connection, both with the composer, Chris Nightingale, also with the producer, Mark Walkus. And then you had people who were linked into the Rombe Ballet. It all came together. We played at the Old Vic, all these type of things. And this is one of the things we talk about bands, what they have to do. If you've got that vision, it opens so many doors. And if you've got that support as well from the movement, they can look in and just say, yep, you were part of a vibrant movement which is outwardly looking. They will come into us. Because these people, they do know about us and they want to use us, but they want to work with the type of people who reflect what they want to achieve as well. So you've got to be linking up with them and be very flexible about your attitudes, about the way you work and what you want to achieve out of it. The end result with regards to the film Pride, it saw myself, Ian Porthouse, going back to our youth in the 1970s, dressed up with little moustaches and terrible hair and glasses, and spending hour upon hour on film sets. I remember something like 5 o'clock in the morning in a tiny little Welsh town called Banwyn, which is close to the place in the original film. We had to march up and down the street playing the march Old Comrades. And we did the first take and we thought, oh, this is easy, isn't it? We were there all day. We had to play the march about 93 times. And it was up and down, take, reset, go back. The film industry is an incredibly labour-intensive industry just to get what you see on the screen. We thought, oh, blimey, they've used us all this time. We're going to be on there for hours. And you look on the screen and, of course, you literally see the back of my head for about 0.5 of a second. And I was waiting I thought fame at last, but it never actually came there. But what actually came out from the film was incredible, both the reception that they gained, but also what it gave for the band longer term. It opened so many doors, and one of them later this year we're doing a live performance with the orchestra, with the film on in Swansea, with a choir. Hopefully it's going to be a packed hall, people singing along and just watching the film with us providing the live music, and we played, of course, a lot of the soundtrack. So from that, 10 years later and 40 years after the miners' strike, there is still a legacy, and a positive legacy which is coming from it.
And it all comes back to the importance of sharing the stories, doesn't it? That's the root of it. That's how we make these connections and bring in these collaborations. And that's a big part of what we're doing with our archive work and with our advocacy work. And a big part of what you do on a day-to-day basis is collecting and sharing the brass band story.
The story's there, though, aren't they? That's the thing. You talk about the miners' strike, and you speak to a generation now. I sound awfully old with that. I was about 17, 18, 19 years of age when the miners' strike was on. And we saw it firsthand. My parents were very much involved in it with the support network and the political network that was going on. They were very much part of it. We used to go to my parents' house and you'd have MPs there, you'd have the miners. They were always there. So you always saw it firsthand. I was working for the DHSS at that time, and we used to make the payments every week of the miners' strike pay, in effect, which was the benefit. And it was cut. I think if I remember, they started something like £15. Then it went down to £10 a week for these people. And they had to come in, and it was like something out of medieval times. People coming in, can I have my money to survive for the family for the week? It was heartbreaking to see. One of the points that you made about reporting on it The banding press didn't report on it a lot of the time because it was very much a political side of it. Although the bands themselves still played a part in it. The Mine Workers' Championships, for instance, which took place in Blackpool, only missed 1 year, and that was 1984. It took place in 1983. The strike occurred at the beginning of 1984 and came back in 1985. And I've got old programmes here, and you look at them, and there was still a very strong representation of bands, names now that have disappeared, still going on up until the 1990s, where finally the pit closures came in, and those bands have disappeared. Some of them have returned, and some remain. Grimethorpe and Carlton Main, for instance, at the top level. There's a band called Clockface in the northwest, which was actually a pit band. They returned there. So that connection hasn't been totally lost. But as you say, it's a part of our history, which we really, I think it's about time that we look back on realistically and found out what bands did during that period of time. So it's an interesting part of our history. I think one of the other things when we talk politically with brass bands is to look at the music that we play. The first we think is the original brass band test piece is Labour and Love, which was written in 1913. Now, it's a great title, but if you've ever played the piece and looked at the foreword to the score, it's a bit flowery. It's all about the working man's desire to get greater something out of his life rather than the drudgery of labour, to find love and trying to find the higher things in life. At the same time that was actually written, there's a famous political book called The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropists by an author called Robert Tressel. It's like a Marxist treatise on the capitalist system through the eyes of workers. They were painters and decorators. It's a fictitious account. And it talks very much the same way of what you find the attitude or the forward is of Labour and Love. The protagonist in it is a chap called Owen. He talks about how workers can strive to have artistic and cultural excellence and better themselves rather than just going through the drudgery. Well, if he had gone to the Crystal Palace competition at the same time, Robert Tressel, he would have found that brass bands were playing a piece rather inspired by the same things. If you go forward as well, Gilbert Vinter wrote a piece for the Trade Unions Council for its centenary in 1969. Edward Gregson wrote a piece for Britain's entry into the European Common Market in the 1970s. And you've got pieces, for instance, after the war. There's a piece called Clive of India, was actually a piece which was written, which was to do with the celebration of Britain's victory in the war, but was renamed something else because it was deemed as possibly too political a title to be played at competition. So we've always got that through the music that we also play as well. So that's always an ongoing thing. There's been some great books published through the banding world. You've got some really good books published from individual bands. And there are books by academics like Trevor Herbert, for instance, which gives you a greater understanding of where bands fit into the wider scheme of things. There's a book by a chap called Peter Hardy. It was brought out not so long ago. It's called Front Row Seat. And that gives his treatise of almost his left-wing thinking of where banding is, but through the eyes of a fictitious contesting band. And it's a really cracking read. It makes both small points and wider points on it. And if you're ever going to read one book about the miners' strike, read Geoffrey Goodman's book. He was the political editor of the Daily Mirror at the time. Very fair book on it, but that will give you a greater idea where the mining communities and the bands, etc., fit into the greater picture as well. There's plenty of stuff out there to read and keep you informed.
Absolutely. One of the most fascinating items from the archive that caught my attention when it was first in this melee on our top floor of our office and all this stuff still to be uncovered was a trophy sponsored by Sir Oswald Mosley, the Silver Challenge Cup.
Yeah, I saw it. I think the previous people who had the archive was given to them. They didn't realise. I don't think it's a very nice cup, isn't it? I've seen it. It is a lovely. It's a lovely cup. And they brought it, I think, strangely to the Mine Workers' Championships in Butlins. Yeah. And I looked at it and saw the name. And I said to the chap, do you know who he was? He looked at me and said, no, So you're right. And the interesting part of it, 1931, he was going through a period of time of trying to get MPs to sit in the general election. It ended in a bit of disaster. Famously, there was a thing called the Siege of Cable Street in 1936. Where all the people in the East End of London, where his black shirts were going to march through the East End, rose up against him and stopped him marching through. And then afterwards, when the war came, of course, he was disgraced, he was imprisoned, whatever. Interestingly, he started off as a Conservative, then became Labour, then became independent, and then became a fascist. So he had interest in life is, and also I think his wife was one of the Mitford sisters.
Yes.
And if we ever read about the Mitford sisters, now there's a
Yes.
there's a colourful bunch. I think he survived until about 1980. Complicated figure, very very complicated figure, and I think his son, oddly, became the man who was running Formula One motor racing for many, many years.
Yes.
Very,
Yeah, that's
very
right.
strange how things do. But I think it'd be interesting to find out from the archive why he presented the cup, where he presented it, and who actually won the competition. But I think it's interesting to talk about the politics of it. He must have thought, give this to the working man. Give these to the type of people we need to make the connection with. We are supporting you. There's echoes of that going on today. There are echoes everywhere. And it was interesting to find out. I wonder how many people looked at that and said, today's trophy is being presented by Oswald, and thought to themselves, nah, I don't want anything to do with this. He may have got some support, but as was shown through history, the vast majority of people were against his views. And thankfully, what happened with it, that competition didn't run for more than just that one occasion. But it'd be wonderful to actually find out a bit more.
Definitely. We'll do some digging. But I think, like you say, there's loads of reflection around what's happening right now and that moment in time, and that kind of political flip-flopping as well.
Politics, like brass banding, is cyclical. You can look at where we are at the moment politically, but you can also go back, as you say, the miners' strike. There was almost coming to the end of, there was a political cycle that was going on with Mrs. Thatcher coming in 1979, which was the end of what was called the post-war consensus, Keynesian politics and economics and all this sort of stuff like that. It does go in cycles. So we may think, blimey, this is awful, but people with a wider memory think, no, it's just reflective of what was happening possibly 100 years ago. And the banding movement had to, in its way, both reflected it, but also had to change as well. Because economically, the days where the mining industry would support brass bands or industry would support brass bands, that came to an end. But brass bands have carried on. We are very resilient. And it's the same with regards to government funding. It would be wonderful if we had treble, quadruple the funding going into brass banding throughout the UK. I think we can do it, but we have to show that we are deserving of it by the work and the outcomes that we actually do ourselves. But there is hope, I think. It's not all doom and gloom.
We're always positive. And certainly what brass bands looked like in the 1930s, what they look like in the 1980s, are very different to what they look like now, from that period where it was very much a working class, male dominated pastime. We've still got a long way to go, but that isn't what I see when I'm working with bands and when I'm in communities. It's a much, much more diverse picture and a much broader demographic of what the UK looks like.
I know that Brass Bands England is it 2030 that you want bands to reflect the communities where they come from? And I think it's very important that we do that. But again, we can only do that if also the politics allow us to do that part of it as well. And there has been liberalisation in all different areas. And we've got to grasp, because there are opportunities which only can be good for banding. But in return, we then got to show the politicians to say, instead of shouting at them and saying how terrible things, you have to say, well, thanks for giving us that opportunity. And this is what we have done with it. The one thing that gets me with the politicians, an easiest vote winner in the world is for them to support brass bands.
Yeah.
Because if you look at it, we do everything that they want of us. All ages, all genders, diversity, reflective of the communities we're in, amateur music making, to a level of excellence which rewards, and also part of an arts and cultural industry which for every pound you put in, you get 4, 5, 6, 7 times back. So as a business model, we're actually very good. Our problem is that possibly we don't realise that, and we have to tell our politicians and bang the drum. And talking about banging the drum, and some politicians are good at it, talking in a cyclical manner. When Keir Hardie, founder of the Labour Party, he was for the West Ham constituency before he went to Merthyr Tydfil. When he went to Parliament, he had a brass band play him in. A brass band was with a politician right at that beginning. Now, wouldn't he be fantastic when it comes to the opening of Parliament? We had brass bands everywhere just saying, oh, you know, Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so, whatever, you're our MP. Would you like us to play you into Parliament? That would be the best advertising that we would ever need for what's good about banding.
Absolutely. So Any politicians listening, invest in bands. It'll be worth it.
It is. You get our vote. Non-political, but you will get our vote. I think that'd be great if you could do that.
Thank you so much, Ewan, for your time. It's a fascinating conversation. I'm sure there'll be many more.
That's lovely. Many thanks indeed.
So we're going to jump forward from 1930s politics to 1980s politics. This year is the 40th anniversary of the miners' strike. Significant for brass bands in terms of bands' involvement in those strikes, but also what industry looked like and the role of brass bands in there.
It was a hugely significant time for an enormous number of colliery bands because, of course, it was the beginning of the end for a lot of them. Some of these mines never opened again. They were flooded and the like, and I guess there'd be other economic reasons that they never opened up again. But it was certainly the beginning of the end. And the whole Thatcher era, actually, for the mining community was a very volatile time nationally, not just in our small world of brass bands. From a historical point of view, it certainly was a time when the decline in numbers accelerated.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to start talking about a decline in brass bands, there's actually been a numerical decline since the 1890s, but that was a real time when the numbers started to decline significantly. And a lot of mining bands just disappeared very quickly. And over the following years to 1992, when, of course, the great announcement just in the week of the National Championships that Grimethorpe won, the historic Brastoff National, which was nothing like the film, there was an enormous number of pit closures then, 30,000 miners made redundant, and went around that. So for a culture to recover from blows like that, just absolutely inconceivable. And a time that I guess we can look back on with some pride that so many bands did survive, even though they haven't seen a bit of coal for well over 30 years, some of them now.
Yeah. Definitely. I would love to be able to talk about interesting archive items related to this, but actually what we found really fascinating is that particularly in the journals, in the bandsman, it's as if it didn't happen. It just isn't reported on and isn't mentioned. Because it was obviously something that was impacting bands all over the country, but I guess the editors at the time didn't feel it was their place to comment on politics.
I think there's a lot in that, actually. Peter Wilson was the legendary long-serving editor of the Bandsman at that time. He would have been in post for about 7 years at that point and still had another 15 and 16 years to go in his tenure. I mean, Peter was a gentleman, very much a musician at heart, and politics might not just have been something that would have sat easily with him. He would have taken the view that this was a brass band magazine, and I'm here to report on brass band and brass band music. And I think that focus away from politics sits entirely with the character of Peter Wilson that I knew. He wasn't somebody who courted controversy at all. He would be playing the middle ground on that one.
When you were the editor of the Bandsman, would you comment on politics? Do you feel that was your place?
Yeah. Different characters, though. You know, we're all built differently. And different social times as well. I think in my years, it was 20 years ago this year, I started as editor of the Bandsman. And, you know, we were in this age of social media and people were much more used to kind of airing their voices on different matters. So I would certainly get more into banding politics than the Bandsman had been for a very, very long time. My banding career had been engaged in the organisational side as much as the playing. I guess that may have been one of the reasons that I took that route more and let the real experts like Paul Hindmarsh and Philip Wilby, etc., concentrate on the finer musical details.
Yeah. And although it might not have been reported on at the time in terms of the impact that it was having on the community, there was certainly music that came out of that era, acid brass.
Well, that came a few years later, of course. That was Jeremy Deller's part of his Turner Prize winning Odyssey, wasn't it? What an impact that had, though.
Yeah.
You know, Fairies did that in the late 90s, and it made a massive impact in the general public, actually.
Yeah.
And I remember doing some of them when I was at Whitburn. We did a few as well in Glasgow, and then we did one in France, actually, and a tremendous reception for it.
Yeah.
But I don't know that brass bands have done anything else in my lifetime that has connected so well with a different part of our culture as acid brass did.
Yeah.
The effect on the audiences was just unbelievable. Everywhere we played it, it was amazing. I had Fairies doing it as well. Remarkable. Fairies were a fantastic band at the time as well.
Yeah.
We keep that in mind. But great arrangements, Rodney Newton's great arrangements are these acid house anthems. And it just seemed to create a buzz around brass bands, the like of which we've never seen.
Yeah.
We've seen fervour around the film and stuff like that, but this was just completely different. And the gigs themselves were sensational.
Yeah. And the mapping that Jeremy Deller did, showing the impact of the strikes and how that led on to the development of house music, and it all links together, and you can see all this kind of mapping of different British culture. On the face of it, house music and brass bands isn't something that you would immediately put together. It sounds great. Conceptually, it makes sense.
But isn't it amazing how much our culture is linked to the miners' strike,
Yeah,
as that was?
Yeah.
So to find out a bit more detail about the impact of the Thatcher era on banding, we spoke to a new young BB trustee, Hannah Beach. I'm with Hannah Beach, who is a cornet player with the Langley Band, and she is also a trustee of Brass Bands England since last year. Hannah has also done a dissertation on cultural representations of music as protest and community in 1980s Thatcherite Britain, which is quite a mouthful there, Hannah, but it's a fascinating read, and I've just spent a couple of hours going through it. Looking at the matter at hand, which is the relationship with brass bands and industry, brass bands and politics, your thesis was focused on a very volatile time in our recent industrial history, especially in an era marked by Margaret Thatcher's different approach to society from anything we've seen before or probably since. Certainly somebody who changed the world and left an indelible mark on the UK society as a whole. So talking about brass bands specifically, where do you see the influence of Thatcherism most?
So one of Thatcher's, not necessarily policies, but ideologies within the Conservative government was that of individualism, which is the idea that everyone was responsible for themselves. They would pursue their own self-interest, and therefore the state doesn't need to intervene because your success in life would be determined by your effort and your willingness to work hard. Brass bands inherently are community-based groups. You can't have a band without people, you can't have a band without community and people getting involved and sponsoring. So just the idea of a brass band itself is the direct antithesis to Thatcher's ideology. So when she came into power and her government started enacting all of her policies, just a band still having existed throughout that time was an active process in itself, especially during deindustrialisation when all the corporate sponsors started falling through and people started relying more on civic philanthropy and getting involved with the community. It became a real source of community pride, and in a way it's kind of ironic that Thatcher's policy of individualism kind of backfired in a way, and that some bands became even more community-based than ever, having to rely on other people and the goodwill of people for sponsoring them.
A couple of the themes that come through your dissertation are those of community and solidarity. Do you think the brass band has played a large part in maintaining that community solidarity as a single entity almost?
Solidarity as a concept relies on us versus them. So when these bands were running out of money and desperately trying to survive when their pits were being closed and their steelworks were being closed, they had to rely on each other and they had to reinforce that this is us, we have to fend for ourselves because no one else is going to. And because that music became quite connected with the idea of mining and industry, the brass band sound sort of became the anthem of solidarity in a way. And you see that a lot in the films that I looked at in my research and throughout history. If you see a time of trouble, strikes or strife, then it's very, very frequent that you'll hear a brass band in the background because their sound is so intrinsically linked with the concept of solidarity. There's a quote from a film studies professor, Eleanor Boschi, who is doing some research on the relationship between popular music and masculinity in The Full Monty, which is a film set in that period of deindustrialisation. And she says, the brass band becomes the exceptional oral vestige of a lost cultural identity that Thatcherism partially wiped out. I thought that was a really nice way of summing up the importance of the sound of the brass band and how that's become so symptomatic of that period of brass band history.
It's one of these things that does affect people deeply, the brass band sound. I think all the community type music that you find in this country, I think the brass band seems to get the closest to people's hearts. You know, up our way, a lot of pipe bands and stuff like that. And the good ones are fantastic. They're really incredibly good. They're as good as Black Dyke or Corey at what they do, and the drummers are amazing. But you can hear them 1,000 miles away. It's not got the same subtlety that a good brass band has got, the different colours that can be created.
I think it's quite amusing when you think of your sort of stereotype of the brass band sound and thinking about, you know, the show Bridgerton.
I don't watch it, but I know of it. Yeah.
All the music is string music, and it's like string covers of popular music. And I was thinking, how bizarre would it be if that was a brass band and the sound would be completely different from the themes they were trying to present there.
The world just doesn't know enough about what we do best. They think that we play marches and hymn tunes, and we are our own worst enemies when it comes to that, because we like to perpetuate that myth. And Brastoff actually was quite guilty of that. It was based on real events, but I mean the whole story was very much dumbed down from the real story. In terms of the music that was played at the Albert Hall, for instance, it wasn't William Tell, it was New Jerusalem by Philip Wilby.
Yeah.
Grime Thought Band were not travelling in the way that they did there. It's a funny depiction. It's really just a love story, isn't it? Yeah. At its heart, it's a love story. But actually, whenever I am in a situation meeting new people, or somebody will ask you what you do for a living, and they'll say, oh, that was the film, wasn't it? Oh, Brastoff, yeah. And you go, yeah, it was. Oh, it was great. That's one of my favourite films. I love all that stuff. And you think, imagine if they'd played some of the really great music that we've got in there. Would they have loved it as much? Maybe not.
It's interesting how it tries to be true to the story, but in a sort of fetishisation for the middle class gaze, and in a way that a lot of working class men are often portrayed in those films. It's not always accurate to the experiences that they faced.
Well, I mean, even like travelling to band practices on your bike with a trombone on your back, you know, it's like, oh my God, how could they come up with that? But trying to make it as northern and as working class as possible, really. But it just went too far for me. I enjoyed it when I first saw it, and I enjoyed it in a lot of ways, partially because I knew a lot of the people in the film. I was able to sit there and, well, that's so I know him. Jim Shepherd was in it, the great Jim Shepherd, who's principal with Black Dyke 50 years ago. But I just thought that for me it was a bit of a work of fiction for me. What I would have loved to have seen at the time, and I never did anything about this either, so I'm no better than anybody else, but I would have loved to have seen somebody making an attempt to benefit brass bands by showing the rest of the world the real picture at the time. Because at that time there was some really great bands around. In the late 90s, there were some really fantastic bands. The impact of the industrial decline hadn't hit terribly hard yet, but you had bands like Grime Thought and Black Dyke and Foden's Desford Fairies were a fantastic band at that time. Leyland were in a lot of stuff. It was a really strong period of high quality performance. Contests like the British Open, I'd go there and play with Whitburn and come 12th, having played out our skin. You know, the same performances nowadays would be getting in the top 3. So it was a fantastic period of performance for brass bands and composition, because you had a lot of new Philip Wilby works getting written at the same time. Revelation.
Sort of golden age, wasn't it?
Revelation was 95, you know, it was just a really exciting time to be involved. Yet we never took the chance to show the rest of the world the real story. We never sold ourselves to the BBC or any kind of proper media out there. That's a great film, a nice story, love story, work of fiction. But you want to know what it's really like? Here's the real story. I think we missed a trick there, and we've paid for it ever since.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that brass band music, and the compositions particularly, they weren't seen as on par with the rest of the music world because of the working class origins that they came from, which is a real shame. And again, that would have been a really nice opportunity to show that they are on par and often above the standard of playing across classical music.
Well, you just need to look in any London orchestra and ask the brass section where they all started. More than half of them all have started in brass bands.
Yeah.
And a lot of the great principal trumpet and trombone players, that's where they've all cut their teeth. Brass bands have always played the music of the people. It was the music of the people at one time because there was nothing else.
Yeah.
It didn't have any electronic route to music at all in the 1850s. But you could go and hear a brass band playing operatic selections from Verdi and Beethoven and stuff like that. So it was the only access that a lot of people had to proper music at the time. But they always played the music of the people. You go and listen to a band playing in a park on a Sunday afternoon. Are they going to be playing the music that people are hearing in the rest of their lives right now? Probably not.
I think it's a difficult balance of respecting the nostalgia of the past and that those pieces were really quite extraordinary. And also, if you do want the audience, then you do have to play what the audience wants to hear. And it's a difficult balance of trying to engage the community and being true to your roots.
I guess one thing bands could do is throw that gem in though. You do your populist concert, but throw Paganini variations in at the end of the first half or something like that. And people love it. I've done it. I've been in that position. You go and do a concert in a town hall somewhere on a Saturday night and you give them all the stuff they want to hear. But here's something that we do. See if you like it.
And you often find that they do. They love it.
Absolutely bowled over by it.
Yeah, they don't expect it at all. Especially if it's their first concert.
And a number of times people would say, I had no idea brass bands could do that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
That proves the point. But here we are, sort of 30 years on from when I was doing that. Not on my own, it has to be said. You know, I was surrounded by a lot of good players in this band I was in. But it feels like we've become less connected to our public than we were.
It's interesting that we still retain the stereotype from the 80s and from that period of everyone's northern and in the mines, when we've come on so far from that. Maybe Brastoff has not helped us shake that stereotype.
Do you think we need to change the way we look when we're doing our banding? It's all a bit military looking sometimes, isn't it?
It is difficult because I do think that the jackets help the sense of identity formation and that I'm part of this band. And I guess it does look maybe old-fashioned to the unknowing eye, but do we go for nostalgia or do we go for innovation? And there's pros and cons to both. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what you wear as long as you do a good job.
And one of the other films that you spoke about in your research was Pride, which was a film that featured the town band from Wales. And that was about the support that the miners during the strike had from the LGBT community in London.
Yeah.
Again, another angle that brass bands are seen almost as a bit of a political tool in there.
Yeah. You see them used throughout the film. There's a particular scene where they're in a pub in Wales and the LGBT leader, Mark Ashton, has just made a speech saying, we're going to raise more money for the miners. And they've responded by singing a protest song, which starts with one person and it's sort of everyone joins in around the pub. And the background of that, the singers don't hear it, but we hear the brass band accompaniment to that song, and then that weaves its way through. So already we've heard the brass band in that real sense of community. And then right at the end, there's this Pride March in London where the whole of the Wales community has come to support the LGBT group. And then the band comes out and you think, there we go, that is the symbol of what that film is trying to say, which is that we all stick up for each other.
I mean, looking into the future, which is always a dangerous thing to do.
Yeah.
Brass bands have got a tremendous social history, a lot of it built upon working class communities across the whole of the UK and now spread worldwide, although much less working class associations when you go into certainly in the European countries. Do you see the future of brass bands being much more community orientated than they are now? In the last 30, 40 years since we've seen the industrial decline from the start of the 1980s, when less investment from industrialists and of course the closure of the mines, the bands that have thrived and amongst that have had to become a bit more community spirited. Do you see the whole genre going that direction?
I do, yeah. I think especially with the real push for getting more youth involved, bringing young people in brings so many other people in. You've got their parents, the people that come to support them, and then these bands playing at community events. It's a real opportunity for everyone to get involved, and especially when bands are struggling for money or looking for ways to move forward. It's always relying on the people around you to lift you up. I think as bands start innovating, they're going to think of ways to include more people, not necessarily playing in the band, but how can we reach more people with the music that we play or the ideas that we promote.
Looking back over my time in banding, there was probably quite a class divide, to be perfectly honest with you, and a lot of it very much a working man's activity in my early years, with very few females involved. Do you see these class divisions there now, or have we largely managed to get rid of that?
It would definitely depend where you look. There's no fast answer if it's fixed. We're all equal. But particularly in my band, we've got a really healthy split of genders and it's a really inclusive environment. So from a personal perspective, it's far better than it was, and I can only imagine that that is going to continue. I think the same can be said for other bands. There's definitely a lot more progress being made, and especially the work of Brass Bands England, for example, doing really good work to improve the inclusivity in the bands. It's come a long way, and that's really nice to see. Always still somewhere to go, but definitely a lot better than it was.
Yeah, there's still quite a few barriers to be addressed. There's no question about that. As you say, it depends where you go. There are different parts of the country, but different approaches to it in general. Anna, it's been great. Thank you so much.
So that shift from being sponsored by industry to going through the miners' strike and the change and decline of industry obviously had a huge financial impact on bands. And that's been quite a difficult shift, and one that we've had to really think about and manage when it comes to our members, because we're funded by Arts Council England and Heritage Fund and lots of other funders. So essentially being funded by government. That's quite a lot to get your head around, really. Fundamentally, we've changed quite a lot.
I mean, we're talking very much as Brass Bands England. You know, we're Arts Council funded. We've been funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund for the archive work as well, and a good collection of other very generous funders that make our work possible. But you also have to think about how the small town silver band, as it is, that used to be the mill band, the colliery band, the aviation works band, whatever it was at a certain time, and how they're managing their transition to non-funded activity. We are, by and large, amateur musicians doing something that we like doing because we like doing it. There are professional musicians involved in banding, obviously, but the vast majority of brass banders are amateurs. And on my travels, I've witnessed quite a lot of people, certainly of a certain generation, who are still wrestling with the challenges of that transition, thinking that they performed a public service that they could have got some recompense for in certain circumstances, to now actually a lot of the most successful community bands are very much paying for what they do.
Yeah. Just
like they would be paying to go down to the tennis club or the golf club or go in to watch a game of football or whatever it is they decide to do with their leisure time. It has become a leisure time activity that is more or less funded by the individual now than it was at one time. And there's still some bands that are wrestling with that, but you have to ask them where the sustainability is at the same time. And just keep doing things the way you did them before is no guarantee of success, especially if there's not some industrialist with deep pockets that's traditionally funded that band.
Yeah, and I think it's a really big culture shift to looking at the individual player as the customer, for want of a better word, making sure that the band environment and the gigs they take on and all of that kind of stuff is attractive to them. That's still quite a big shift for a lot of people. But like you say, sports is the closest parallel that we can draw, and people expect things to be in certain order if you contribute financially as an individual, and lots of bands do that brilliantly. But to go from a point where a lot of community bands feel a duty to offer what they do for free, there's a reality that money needs to come from somewhere to do that.
And if they can afford to do that in a sustainable manner, then that's great.
Yeah.
That really is great. But it's not always the case. Of course, there are ways that bands can be funded, especially for artistic projects and community, for the community benefit. And it's a big part of our work at Brass Bands England, facilitating that work for our members, helping them to achieve what they want to do. But it's a process that bands have got to engage with. There have to be creative ideas there. It's not just a matter of turning up and saying, give us some money because we're a brass band.
Yeah.
And that is actually something that bands have struggled with in the past. We know that. We've heard that from major funders, that quite often we've just had a band has just come along and said, no, give us some money because we're a brass band. It doesn't really work like that.
No.
There has to be purpose to every application. But there are ways to do it. If you look at some of the exemplar organisations, they do it brilliantly. So just watch what Foden's do and watch what Shepherd Group Band and Amersham and bands like that are just seemingly doing everything right at the moment. Yeah. That's probably a better indication of the future of brass bands, the healthy future of brass bands, than, sadly, those that are built around the history that we've had.
Next time on the Brass Band podcast, we're going to be looking at women in banding, exploring why women were historically underrepresented in bands and highlighting significant figures. See you then.
The Brass Band Podcast Archive Edition is brought to you by Brass Bands England. Thank you to Arts Council England, National Lottery Heritage Fund and the Scottish Power Foundation for their support. Thanks also to World of Brass for the beautiful music they provided. To listen to all of the music from this episode and so much more, head to whatplayed.com.
To find out more about this series and the wider work of Brass Bands England, head over to our website at bbe.org.uk and follow us on social media. If you think you have a unique item that would be suitable for the archive, get in touch with us by emailing archive@bbe.org.uk.
If you enjoyed the podcast, please leave us a 5-star review and make sure you're subscribed to avoid missing out on any of our upcoming episodes. Share your favourite moments on social media and use the hashtag BrassBandPodcast. Your support goes a really long way. Thanks for listening and stay tuned for our next episode.